Hi and welcome back to Bike Speeds. So this week we're going to service this Claud Butler Criterium. This is a lovely mid-90s steel bike. I think this group set ran from 91 to 99, somewhere around there. We're going to service this up. We're putting a new chain on this one. We're putting a couple of new cables. We're putting some new tyres on this one. New handlebar tape. We're just going to do some details just to sort this bike out to really bring it back to its former glory. So as you can see, there's a lot of debris and dirt on this bike. The chain is stretched out at 0.75. This is a great time to get this bike serviced and to get this chain changed before it wears out that beautiful old group set. I believe this bike's been pulled out of a shed and someone's now started using it and they're starting their cycling career on this bike. So this is a lovely service to do to really bring this bike up and make it nice and ready to ride. So this bike hasn't done a lot of mileage, but we just need to clean it up and just give it a routine service. So you can see there on the cassette that was quite grimy, just needs to go through the ultrasonic cleaner. Same with these brakes, they're a little bit ingressed. I think this bike's actually been oiled quite well, and it's the oil that has pulled some of the dirt to the bike. So this has probably had a spray oil put on it in its past, and then once we clean it off and just lubricate the actual pivot points itself, the bike will be lubricated nicely but won't pick up that dirt quite so badly or so quickly. So again, you can see on this derailleur there's a lot of dirt and debris that's quite wet looking. I think that's just where it's been sprayed with oil at some point, and that's just caught the dirt and has made the bike dirty. So we get all the group set off. So you can see here the front derailleur again, that wet look. It's not too dry, but we'll get all these parts off. We'll clean them all up through the ultrasonic cleaner, and then we'll check the bearings and everything on the bike, and when we're happy that everything's ready to go back together, we'll put the bike back together. So even these shifters, you can see the dirt mark around those. We'll clean this frame up afterwards and really sort that out. It had a quite badly frayed cable. You can see here it was weird because it spooled itself. And normally a cable that started a brake only shows at the point of breakage. You'll just get a few strands, but this one was really falling to pieces. So we're going to put new derailleur cables on this bike as well. Off comes the chain set, because as you'll see shortly, there's a reason why we're taking it off and giving that a clean up. So the chain set comes off, so we're right back to the frame. Now we did have an issue with this rear brake. There was a lot of movement in this brake. It would have given a quite a nasty brake feel, really. It would have moved around. You can see here there's a lot of dirt and debris on it, but it had this movement. Look at that arm. We had a job sort of filming this, but there was a lot of movement there. That was a good 4 or 5 millimeters forward and backwards on itself, which shouldn't have had, so we're going to deal with that. We also took the bottle cage off, which you'll see the reason why that was as well as we're moving through the service. And I wouldn't normally take mud guards off, but in this instance I did, because they were held on with tie wraps and we had to undo those tie wraps to get the components off. So we're going to just put new tie wraps on. So the fact we wanted to wash down the frame, we decided to take those off. Now note here, all these components had stickers on them to say the model number. That wasn't engraved into the component itself, so I didn't want those stickers to lift off in the ultrasonic cleaner. So we mounted all these components so as the stickers were out of the ultrasonic cleaning solution, so that we didn't damage those, because that's part of the heritage of the group set. So that's why we hung those parts and did this in 2 lots. Now you can see here this chain set itself is very, very clean. In where the bolts hold there, you can see that build up of grime. So we're going to actually clean these off, and that's why we stripped all this down. And again, the stickers, we held it out of the ultrasonic cleaner and we turned that big ring so that sticker stayed out of the ultrasonic cleaning solution and didn't get blasted off. So you can see here on that component, the sticker's still on it, and that was why we did that with those parts. Just a little bit more sympathetic in our approach to cleaning them. So now we're going to just wash all those parts off. They've all been through the ultrasonic cleaner, so we're just going to wash them off now, get all that degreaser off before we start to lubricate these parts. So as I said, this is a mid-90s, 91 to 99 bike. I remember at that time I was riding around on a rally equip. It was white with red lugs and corners. I remember that bike distinctly because it had a lovely click to the downshifter on the down tube. So what bike was you riding around in back in the 90s? I also had a rally mountain bike as well, but the rally equip is the one I remember of this period of time. So tell us in the comments what you were riding, if you were riding, and if you're new to riding, what was your first bike? Not many people are still riding around on the bike they were riding around on in the 90s. They'll have upgraded and moved on from that by now. Now we're just cleaning off the chain set. This is post full chromed bikes really. This is actually a painted and lacquered component, that part. So although you got a lot of aluminium like on here, that part was painted. So this was sort of just when the chroming was disappearing and parts were becoming anodized and things. So you can see there, I just adjusted up that movement in that rear brake. It was a locked nut. I don't really know why that would have come loose. It's probably was seized at some point and someone's slackened it off it. I don't think it would come loose by itself because it was all quite tight. We just lubricate that part up and make sure that pivot's moving. And then we don't use the old silicone grease very often, but on those sliders for that rear brake spring, I used a little bit of silicone on there. And I've also lubricated the thumb adjuster just to make my job easier as I put the bike back together. And now I'm just lubricating the jockey wheels, a little bit of premium grease on there just to help those glide in their sliders, and they should run nicely. And I've also just put a little bit of Loctite 222 on the threads of those bolts there, which we do, as you'll see in other videos, just stops those bolts coming undone and causing any problem with the derailleur. And again, another thumb adjuster that I'm just lubricating before I put it back together, just to make my job easier with the adjustments, and also as the bike moves through its life, it will make the adjustment future down the line a little bit easier for me to do as I'm servicing the bike in the future. Lubricate all the pivot points on them front and rear derailleurs, lubricate the springs as well, a little bit of premium grease on there, that just stop those going rusty, and even the quick release skewers. I lubricate the lever itself, a little bit of grease along the shaft, that'll just stop it sticking inside the wheel, and a little bit of copper slip on the thread itself, and that's ready to go back in the bike. And then we just also lubricate the chain set bolts just to help those center and go in nicely, and they spin in lovely. And I mean, look at that chain set, looks like a new one. You know, it's amazing how this stuff comes up really. And torque that up along the way. I've said in the past that I always torque up the chain sets as I'm building them, so that everything there is in its final position, so as I can adjust the front derailleur correctly. And this bike, again, being a 90s bike, I don't know where those tyres came from with that lovely blue lining around them, but we're putting a new tyre on there. He also asked me to check the tensions of the spokes on the rear wheel. You can see what a huge difference. You look at this next graph, that rear wheel was way off. Look at it there. The tensions were just all over the place on that back wheel. He felt it had a new spoke at some time. I don't know if he'd done that with someone else, but once we retensioned it, you can see we got the tensions much nicer across that wheel. So that wheel's going to ride for thousands of miles like that in a much better condition than it was when it came in. On goes the new tyre, directional tyres rotating the correct way, logo lined up with a valve, just little details like that I like to do along the way when I'm servicing a bike, just to make sure everything is really nice on the bike. Inflate that up, and then I'm just going to clean up this hub. I always like to clean these hubs up before I put a cassette on, because you can get that grime, and when you're spinning that cassette you can actually force that grime into the bike. So I'm just using a little bit of brake cleaner just to clean up that surface, and then I know that there's no grime going to hold under that cassette and spoil either the way it seats or indeed the way it works on the wheel. So also just check the hub and the spokes and the rim of the bike by washing it down, just to make sure everything there is nice, and a little bit of fresh grease on there before we slide on that cassette. I mean, even that cassette, look at the way that's come up and cleaned up, and it's just a nice way to work on your bikes, is to get everything clean before you put them back together. Torque that up, and now we're ready. The wheels are ready to go on, all components are cleaned and lubricated and ready to go back on. So I'm just going to give this frame a little clean up, just a little bit of work in odd places. I noticed this bearing was loose. I also noticed the stem of the bike was slightly too high within that bearing, but I advised on that for the customer because he'd been setting this bike up for himself. So I didn't lower the handlebars, but I did give him advisory that they were slightly too high in the bearing. And locked that bearing off, adjusted that. It didn't need replacing. The bearings on this bike were all okay. This bike actually hadn't done many miles, even though it was an older bike. I can just tell from cleaning it down and doing the work on it that the bike has not done many miles. And then we're going to polish this one up, because we got to this stage where the bike was fully stripped down, so it made sense to give this lovely old paintwork a little bit of a polish, and just to help it along its way. Cleaned up that sticker there where there was a little bit black on there, and just worked my way through the frame of the bike with the polish. And I'm just sort of cleaning off any odds and ends, any film that's built up from road film and grease and oils and things, and just make sure that's all off, and then just give the bike a buff down. And this is now looking really nice. And I always enjoy these old paints. They seem to really take to the polishing process. They really shine up nicely. And then I also just put a little bit of ceramic spray on this bike. It didn't do any harm. This was actually a little bit of above and beyond to what the customer had actually was having done to the job in terms of just a service. But when we're filming a bike and when we've got a bike stripped down to this, and it's a lovely old steel bike like this, a little bit of ceramic spray doesn't do it any harm. It really helps that paint pop out as I'm doing the servicing, and it just presents better to the customer anyway. So even though he technically hadn't paid for that, I did it anyway. And you can see here those lock nuts on that bearing, so I'm just going to lock that off now, and that's now absolutely perfect. There was nothing wrong with that bearing, it didn't need lubricating, but that's now locked off and won't come loose. And now I can start on the rebuild process. So front brake, we start at the front, work our way back. Front brake and front mudguard back on, ready to take the wheel. So I put new zip ties on there just to hold that in the correct position. Same with that lovely rear brake that we've now adjusted and sorted out. So new cable ties on there as well. Seat all that in its right position first, and then I can get the wheel on and just make sure that they're in their correct spot so they're not rubbing the tyre too badly. Nip off those tails tight as I can to just make that a little bit neater than it was, because the tails that were on there was quite sharp and edgy, so we've also sorted that out along the way. Pop on these lovely shifters. Can't beat a downshift, can you, down on the down tube? It's funny how things have changed where now all the shifters are all in the handlebars, but I think we all used to enjoy leaning down and clicking our gears on these lovely old bikes. Torque up that chain set, 40 newton meters on that bolt, and a little cover back on there, so as I know that's in its perfect spot for the front derailleur when we start to adjust that. Get on this other pedal arm, same again, torque it up, everything's perfect. Get the cap on, and then I just put a little bit of grease on the threads of the pedals just to stop those binding inside those pedal arms if ever he needs to change his pedal. And again, we torque those up. Don't want to over tighten your pedals, or indeed under tighten them. I've seen them where they've rotated on themselves because they're not tightened enough. Likewise, you don't want to over tighten them and spoil that bike. So 40 newton meters on these ones, and that's all beginning to look nice. And then on goes our front derailleur. You can see that sticker on there, 300EX. That was the stickers that I was talking about with the ultrasonic cleaner, of not wanting to get those through the solution and spoiling them. Again, this printed logo on the casing of the rear derailleur, I wasn't sure how that would react to ultrasonic cleaning, so I hung that out of the bath as well. On goes one of our lovely silver chains, lovely and shiny, really makes a difference to the way the bike presents. And then I'm also going to change the bolts in the bottle cage, and also put in 2 accessory bolts in this down tube that were missing on the bike when it came in. So they're going in there, they're new ones in there. Put a little bit of copper slip inside there just to stop those sticking to the threads. Should they get water in there and start to corrode, that should just stop any problems there. And we're actually reusing the brake cables. They were absolutely fine, there was no need to replace those. Everything was actuating as it should on the brakes, with the exception of the play in the rear brake. So we reused those, new tails on there, there's no need to replace those. Those brakes were working absolutely perfectly, so quite happy with those. But we are just going to put in brand new cables for the front and rear derailleurs. It made sense, we had to take those off. We had the frayed one, so we decided to replace both of them. Again, new cables, new ends, and that will just help the bike actuate perfectly with the gearing. New outers as well into that thumb adjuster, which we've lubricated, so that should now adjust nicely as we go. So we get everything on, nip off the tail, put new end on there, adjust the gears accordingly, and just make sure they're absolutely running perfectly. And on this sort of bike, they're always going to run perfect because it's not too complicated, it's not too many gears, there's plenty of spacing on this front one, just absolutely perfect. And now we're just going to check the saddle, the torque wrench, and we're also going to replace the handlebar tape on this bike as well. We get off the old. I actually didn't clean up the handlebars on this bike because that actually debris that's on there will actually help the new bar tape grip and really be tight, so that there's no issues with it moving as the bike's ridden. So that's what I did there. Get the new handlebar tape on, nice little end on there. I always try and cut that so that it doesn't come round to the top where the rider can see it, so that it's finished underneath the handlebars, any edges or ends, and so that just makes that a nice little finish on the handlebar tape. So again, both sides, we're just using a cork bar tape on this one. It's a little bit more traditional with the way that the bike was, so it's not too padded and not too plasticky like a modern tape. It's just a little bit nicer and a little bit more in keeping with the bike, and the style of the bike was with the handlebar tape that we chose to use on this one. Again, nip that off so as it tucks underneath, and then just pop in the ends. and this bike is really beginning to come together now. Quite happy with the way it's looking. Everything's adjusted and working. All the brakes are sorted, new chain, all the cables, and you can see from these before and afters, this was just a routine service. But what a huge difference we can make to this bike. So thanks for watching. If you've made it this far and you're not a subscriber, do hit the subscribe button. It's the only reference point we've got to seeing how successful the channel's becoming. So please do subscribe, do hit the notification bell, do drop us a comment about your 90s bike, and thanks for watching, and we'll see you again next week. Bye for now.